Hi class, we're going to continue the article from yesterday, The Hunt for Ray Graycar, 15 Years of Clues, Theories, and the Search for Answers. Here goes. Anniversary stories are, or were, the bread and butter of journalism. I've written a lot of them. The one I wrote about Ray in 2015 felt different. It was centered mostly around law enforcement and the uneasy feeling many had about the case. Their recollections were tinged with regret, a vague longing for the case that got away. Just about any time someone finds a body, it makes me think about Ray. Darrell Zacagney, the lead investigator in the early days, told me as we spoke in his living room on the outskirts of Bellefonte. I wonder if it's him. As he posed for a portrait in the field behind his house, he mentioned that Griecar still haunts him. It wasn't clear if Zacagney meant the case or the person, and, at the time, I didn't ask. He kicked the dirt at his feet, straightened his back and raised his chin, then stared directly into the camera. Journalists, like cops, have preoccupations. Griecar became one of mine. After that 2015 story, I pitched my editors on a podcast. This was months after NPR's Serial, but there was no easy way to sell ads for it. I persisted, gently, and sometimes not so gently, in between stories about drug policy and drinking water. Eventually, Penn Live greenlit a documentary, and I set out anew. Zacagney was my first call. Today, he's retired and driving rideshare. He declined a second interview, saying he doesn't fully trust his memory anymore. And besides, what's done is done. But he politely encouraged me to keep at it, and click, the line was dead. My second call was from Bob Buhner, former Montour County District Attorney and, as the aforementioned judge would say, a character. Buhner, known for his swagger in and out of the courtroom, is one of the few mainstays of the Griecar case. When it languished for months and then years, he stepped up as an outspoken critic. In the button-down world of law enforcement, Buhner stuck his neck out in a big way. He staged a press conference in Lewisburg near the Street of Shops, alongside then Clinton County District Attorney Ted McKnight, to call for the state Attorney General's office to step in. I'd have to say it was somewhat unprecedented, he says in a conference room at the old courthouse in Danville, but nobody was doing anything to find out what happened to Ray Griecar. Buhner succeeded in angering a lot of his colleagues and several Harrisburg politicos, but not much else. I interviewed McKnight at his Victorian home on a leafy street in Lock Haven. Amid a chorus of ticking clocks that burst to life at irregular intervals to mark the hour, he spoke cryptically about dark forces that didn't want the case to be solved. I quit being active in this case a number of years ago, he says, because I thought I'm making a little too much noise. I'm a threat. I don't want to be a threat. I want to live, because if you add all of it together, the case will not be pursued. So what's the point? In case you're wondering, McKnight has the look. Should we be worried? The videographer, and incidentally a father of two, asked from behind his camera. Possibly. That interview led to a memorable 2-hour-long ride home. As of this writing, all three of us are still alive. Buhner, for his part, seemed less grandiose in his theories, but no less concerned about their implications. If a sitting district attorney can go missing and law enforcement officials do next to nothing to solve his disappearance, what chance does an average citizen have when their loved one goes missing? He says. The answer is, boy, not very much. Buhner's anguish is palpable. He shakes his head at the thought and stares off into the middle distance for a moment. Then he tells me about the informant. I've used a number of anonymous sources in my time as a reporter. Before I grant anonymity, the person has to pass the sniff test. That is, I need to know who they are, why they're talking to me, and why they absolutely must share this information anonymously. Political hacks use the cover of anonymity to smear opponents, corporate types to gain leverage in the market, and ladies at the auxiliary bake sale because they heard it once on Law and Order and are too polite to just say no. For the record, none of these are good reasons. I did some legwork before meeting the informant. To answer the first question, I reached out to a few more people in law enforcement who were familiar with him. They vouched for him, at least hypothetically, as a plausible source because he already served as a police informant in a somewhat high-profile case. It didn't get much press coverage, but the informant's actions may very well have saved someone's life. That doesn't necessarily mean everything the informant says about Ray Gricar should be taken as gospel. On the second question, the informant didn't seek me out. I found him, his story, at least the version I heard secondhand, merited follow-up, and so I went about trying to find him. He moved around a lot, but I soon found a last known address. One day, with the videographer in tow, I went to a nondescript apartment complex. I knocked on his door, then paused to listen. Knocked again. Paused. No response. I wrote him a note, ripped the page from my notebook, and left it wedged with my business card in the jam. A neighbor confirmed that yes, the informant lived there, but he came and went at odd hours because of his job. The next day, I got a call. So I hear you're looking for me. Ray's idyllic drive on an unusually warm Friday 15 years ago had some precedent. He'd once gone to a Cleveland Indian game. He grew up in the suburbs, attended law school at Case Western, and worked as a prosecutor there, without telling a soul. An acquaintance would later notify police of a sighting just one day prior at Raystown Lake, more than an hour's drive from Bellefonte in the opposite direction. Initially, Patty didn't suspect anything. After work, she went straight to the gym. It wasn't until 11 o'clock that night that she phoned the local police. Dixon's first assumption was that Ray wrecked his Mini Cooper somewhere off of a rural road where passers-by couldn't see. That night, he issued a bolo, cop jargon for be on the lookout, and the next morning he went up in a state police helicopter to look for just that. Generally speaking, missing adults don't get such scrutiny, but this was the district attorney. When you hold an office like that, I don't care what anybody says, you'll get a little more favored treatment than Susie Homewife who doesn't come home tonight, said Zacagney, who became the lead investigator because he showed up to work first that Saturday morning. Bellefonte is one of those small towns where everybody knows everybody else's business. In 2005, it didn't take for long for word to spread that the DA was missing. After all, he'd been a familiar face since he left his native Ohio in 1980 to become Center County's assistant DA. 5 years later, he was elected to the top job. Weaver's tenure as chief didn't overlap with Ray's, but he did encounter him many times as an officer in criminal prosecutions. He was aloof, he remembered. He was not the kind of guy I would sit down to have a cold one with. That was a common description among those who crossed paths with him in the courthouse. From the outside, he appeared so committed to his work that he was known to pass colleagues in the hall without acknowledging them, his eyes focused on some goalpost in the middle distance until they initiated conversation. Ray's most famous cases tended to revolve around violence against women. He garnered national attention in 1993 when he used DNA, tire tracks, and gas receipts to link the murder of 17-year-old runaway Dawn Marie Birnbaum to a cross-country trucker, one of hundreds who passed through the county on I-80 on any given day. That advocacy drew Buhner's attention. Such cases can be difficult to prosecute, he said, but Ray took them on. Many times they're a he said, she said kind of case, he said. One of the keys to a case like that is to have your witness prepared so they can present a compelling case. But there was another side to Ray's earnestness, something Buhner perceived as gullibility. His friend would be so distracted with the affairs of the day, he wouldn't notice when his leg was being pulled. If he needed something from me, I would ask him if he could get me Penn State tickets, he said, and he would say, I can't do that, and I would tease him that he probably had Coach Joe Paterno's number on speed dial. Public defender Deborah Lux often found herself on the opposing end of Ray's withering closing arguments. One time she watched him strangle Recessa Annie, a CPR training doll, as he counted down the time it took the alleged killer to murder his victim. Another time, he brought the armchair her client was allegedly sitting in when he shot his wife. Ray sat in the chair as he described the shooting to the jury. I never thought when Ray did those things in his closing arguments that they were gimmicks, she said. To me, they were masterful. Lux, who still works in the public defender's office and has the cluttered office to show for it, got an unguarded view of Ray's mischievous side that few people in Bellefonte did. Yes, he could be an intimidating adversary, and yes, he could be cold and almost magisterial, summoning colleagues to his office for formal meetings rather than picking up the phone, but he also had an almost boyish sense of humor. Before launching into one such story, Lux hesitated, issuing a disclaimer. This is going to sound really sick, but Lux was defending a client who killed someone with a machete, slashing their throat. As was his wont, Ray summoned Lux to his office. He revealed that he purchased a replica machete, the one in evidence was covered in blood, to use in one of his breathtaking courtroom demonstrations. The manufacturer sent him two. Ray wanted her to have the duplicate. I took it down to the office, Lux remembered, laughing. One of the assistants was playing around with it, and I said, no, I'm taking this back upstairs to Ray before someone gets hurt. But Ray thought it was pretty cool. The informant wasted little time in making demands. How are you going to guarantee my safety? He asked, his eyes narrowing after sharing his story in all its grisly detail. Once again, I set my pen down. I stared back. There's no sense in making promises I can't keep. Just as I opened my mouth to say as much, the waitress arrived with a steaming carafe to top off our coffee and asked if we'd like to order food, and mentioned the key lime pie, made special by the chef, with fresh key lime. 3 minutes later, our tete-a-tete continued. I can't guarantee you protection, I replied, but we can talk about whether we identify you. The informant stirred in another splash of cream and sugar. He thought about it for a moment, and thus the conversation continued. I saved my most important question for last. Why? The last time he cooperated with police, it was to save a man's life. He didn't ask for leniency, and he didn't expect it. Now it's been years since he was told the story of what happened to Ray, and years since he told the state police. He didn't expect leniency then either, and he didn't get it. They can't do nothing for me, he said, but I want that family to have some closure. They deserve to know what happened. After a few interviews with the investigators, the informant never heard from them again. That was back in 2009 and 2010. And he expected he'd take the story to his grave. A peaceful death from something ordinary. Tony Greekar was in his mid-20s in 1996 when Ray took leave from Center County and joined his family in the search for his older brother and Tony's father, Roy. I learned the value of media cycles the hard way back then, Tony recalled. Roy, then 53, had recently retired from a job at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio. The police there asked the standard questions, Tony said, but there didn't seem to be as much sense of urgency until Ray arrived. Ray took lead in mobilizing the search, even issuing a plea for the public's help to the Dayton Daily News. Roy's body was eventually pulled from the Great Miami River, downstream from where his car was found. The coroner ruled the cause of death a drowning, and Roy's history of deep depression led police to assume a suicide. Nearly 9 years later, Tony would find himself stepping into Ray's old role, serving as family spokesman. The suspected crime scene, an abandoned car near a river, was eerily familiar. I looked at it and he said, "He's in the river," he said. Tony doesn't blame Dixon and Zaccagni for making the assumption, but as soon as he uttered those words, it seemed like suicide became the investigator's lead theory. Of course, it was also his own. Tony spent much of his time along the river searching for any sign of his uncle. 15 years later, he's not so sure. If it's a suicide without a body. That river changed so much from one week to the next because of the spring melt. The question is, how far could a body have gotten? Later, Tony drove his uncle's car across the Route 192 bridge to see if it was possible to throw a laptop across the passenger seat, through the window, and out to where it was found. The answer was no. Of course, even that fact doesn't conclusively point to any one theory. Anyone could have disposed of the laptop from any number of places near the bridge. There's almost no evidence in this case whatsoever, Tony said. The best evidence is circumstantial. That's what's most maddening. Back in 2005, Ray's family found themselves in the surreal position of trying to drum up interest in the disappearance of a middle-aged man amid coverage of a new pope and the media circus around the disappearance of so-called runaway bride Jennifer Wilbanks. After a national media feeding frenzy, Wilbanks was found, alive and unharmed.